Welcome to the Apologetics.com radio show, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. I'm Harry Edwards, your host for this evening, and joining me in the studio live in person are my good friends, Dr. Jacob Daniel. Hello.
Hi there.
Hello.
Yeah.
You weren't with us last time.
I was not, but
Yeah.
I'm here.
You're
today.
here now in the flesh. And Lenny Esposito.
Good morning. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm always thankful. I feel like I'm one of the most blessed guys because I get to do apologetics with you guys and talk about apologetics issues, which is kind of like what we like to do. And so if you're listening, we are live, and we invite you to give us a call. And that number is 888. I actually don't have my notes with me. Oh, yeah. 888-995-5552. Or if you forget, that's 888-995-KKLA. We're going to be talking about something that's actually hard to talk about. We went through several iterations of the title, did we not, gentlemen?
We did, yeah.
And so I think we landed on whatever's on Facebook.
The Ascent.
The ascent of porn and the descent of culture.
There you go.
Right.
That's what we're landing on. We had like a dozen options. And the reason why it's hard is because there's a large segment of culture that still respects the power of sex and is held to a different and higher standard. So it's a little hard because we're at a crossroads right now where porn is the norm, but we're getting divided over that, right? I mean, there's the porn culture, which is really hard to imagine that it actually exists. And then there's still the traditional people with traditional values, and I want to say that that's part of us, but
But even the people with traditional values have more access, easier access to porn, and are partaking in it. Even they found that up to 4 out of 5 active Christian men, active
Wow.
church Christian men, are engaged in some kind of pornographic
The
access.
majority.
Yeah.
Wow.
At
Yeah.
some point. Yeah.
Some
So-
point, yeah.
And also, whether it be justified to say that we are traditional enough that we are now allowing for premarital sex, which has been normalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Though
Well,
we might
even-
be some traditional about
You're right.
porn,
Right.
but on other things, we are not as traditional as we used to be.
Yeah, that's true. And we're no longer shocked at divorce, at no-fault divorce.
Right.
In fact, it's not even weird to think that even elders and deacons are divorced. And it's not a big issue. Nobody bats an eye anymore in some churches.
In some churches.
I'm not saying it's your churches, but in some churches.
Yeah.
You know, whereas maybe a few generations ago, that would be a big source of shame. For many reasons. If you are joining us and you're curious, you know, we do the show here every last Saturday of each month, and we have been tackling Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. So Lenny and I, we did chapter 7. Now we're doing chapter 8, The Triumph of the Erotic. And I feel like the author, Carl Trueman, has done a masterful job of, and I keep mentioning this, setting the intellectual or academic framework for how we can understand the pornification, I'm going to call it, of America or of the West. And so that's really his project, is how did we get here? I'm borrowing this from Trueman here, but the first question I want to tackle, and maybe it's worth considering, is this question. How did we get from having the Rolling Stones change the lyrics of "Let's spend the night together" to "Let's spend some time together" in order to perform on the popular Ed Sullivan Show, to now Miley Cyrus sex act with a microphone at the Glastonbury Festival? That is really the question. Why? How is that we're no longer shocked by that? How did we get? So I'm asking, how did we get here? The book is asking, how did we get here? So we're like chapter 8, and this is like this is toward the end now. This is toward the end, and I think Carl Trueman I love chapter 7 and 8. This is perfect. And we'll talk about, obviously, chapter 8, the triumph of the erotic. So, gentlemen, what are, maybe you can lead us through this genealogy of ideas that has led us here.
Well, originally, again, Truman starts off with the idea that we've moved into a psychological man, as Philip Reif would put, that our ideas of success, of attainment, are based on what we internalize, what we internally understand ourselves to be. And that's a drastic break from all of human history, where mostly, whether it's through the measuring against the church's standards, measuring against the standards of the polis, or measuring against the standards of economics, you all measured yourself against the society as a whole. Now you're measuring yourself against your own desires. Freud obviously plays a huge part in this kind of shift. And what Freud does is not simply say that your inner feelings, your inner desires are real, but he also says that you as a being are primarily sexual in your desires. It's the hidden sexual tendencies that undergird your motivations. And the 20th century artists and others who are grasping onto this, they like that idea. And while Freud, even today, if you know, nobody lies on the psychoanalyst's couch anymore. That Freudian psychoanalytics, everybody says, give me a pill for that. They don't say, tell me about your relationship with your mother. That's not how you conquer schizophrenia, right?
Right.
But this idea seems to have stuck, the idea that we're sexual, and nobody seems to be questioning that our sexual proclivities and desires are somehow not simply part of who we are, but the primary force of who we are. And
he's saying it's also repressed.
Freud would say it's repressed, but Freud said that repression was necessary for society to
civil
function.
Society, right?
And then the Frankfurt School and these guys came up and said, no, you need to free that.
That's right.
It's they turned Freud on his head.
Right,
as
in
what
the
Kuhn
couch
says.
of revolution. Again, that's where we get Marx.
Right.
Yeah,
Joining of Marx
Freud.
and Freud.
Right.
And to kind of touch upon that, I would also say that there's an attempt, I think, Lenny, we were talking about this the other day during the podcast, that if you go all the way back to the Genesis, one of the key notions there is that Adam and Eve didn't have any shame between them because of that intimate relationship that which they had. But because of sin, we see that shame kind of enters into their understanding. So I think the attempt in our culture today is through the way of catechism, the way culture catechizes us. The attempt is basically to remove all kinds of shame in any kind of sexual intimacy.
Right.
So for that to happen, you have to remain all constraints around sexuality. As you mentioned, Freud understood it to be the basic nature of human being. If it is basic, it's only when it gets expressed you can truly be authentic.
Right. And back to Rousseau again.
Yeah.
That
Natural man.
The natural man. Our real authenticity is what maybe you can imagine a young child to be. That's we're letting our inner child out.
Yeah.
And that's the real us. So I guess if you look at a child, they're innocent and they're uninhibited.
Uninhibited.
Yeah, uninhibited. That's how we should live life. Like you were saying, no constraints.
Yeah.
So isn't it interesting that one of the critiques that we hear, especially from women today, is that men won't grow up. They refuse to grow up. Well, yeah, that's the whole point of today's culture, is to be infantile in your responses. Take whatever I want, right? I want food, so I slam my fist on the ground. I say, I want food, give me food, give me food, give me. That's what a child does. I want sex, give me sex, give me sex. And we're being infantile in all of these aspects.
We always have these images of 34-year-old men in the basement of their mom's house playing video games all day, right?
Exactly.
And I think if you look at Freud's understanding of the whole appetite and instincts, and so if we look at that, I think we are basically in some way confirming what he's been pointing at. And in so doing, what we're adopting is the whole idea of presentism, the idea that I have to have pleasure now, right?
Now.
Without any consequences, without any kind of responsibility to be taken or commitment that would involve a long-time relationship. That's why we are in a culture where there's so much of attack on marriage, because marriage is the first basic unit of authority that puts constraint around sexuality, right? And that's why exactly what we are seeing in culture, how it is being attacked.
Yes. That's why at least the three of us were very concerned about this, and hence the move toward cultural apologetics. I believe what we're doing is what I'm hoping a lot of our colleagues are doing and addressing some of this stuff, because our world today, just going back 8 years ago, seems totally different. I mean, of course, there's the pandemic. There's a little bit of the recession that happened there. It's unrecognizable. You're right. I think the greatest danger right now, even in an apologetic sense, is the destruction of the family.
Yeah.
Through, again, the sexual revolution. That's why Carl Trueman is helpful here. I want to move to the main topic of this chapter. And we know this sexual revolution didn't happen all at once. Again, that's like the frog in the kettle. I mean, movements just don't happen all at once. So we know it happened slowly, and there's a sneaky way in which this happened, and we want to talk about this. And it really invaded our culture. The whole pornography, the acceptance of it, invaded our culture through the arts, namely surrealism. So we want to talk a little bit about that. What was that period in art history like? Maybe somebody can give a quick definition of surrealism, and who are the main actors there?
Yeah, the surrealism is interesting, and Trueman says this isn't simply the only way. Obviously, there were many different avenues, but this is a clear-cut example of how we see the arts being co-opted and leveraged to a specific end. Before surrealism, you had impressionism. So primarily, the arts used to be folks like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, even Raphael. You would paint images that would be more or less something that you could identify easily.
Depict reality.
They would depict reality. They would do so in a very skillful way. They would try to raise the idea of humanity or picture the best of what humanity is, or at least illustrate the bad and why it's bad. So you think Dante's, Inferno and things of this nature. Then Impressionism came, and that took realism a step removed. It was how I perceive, and it's meant to evoke feeling more than idea. From Impressionism, we had a move into illogic, Dadaism, but we also had a move into surrealism. And surrealism was, Andre Breton was the kind of the father of surrealism in the 1920s, where they took the idea of letting your unconscious mind loose. So even if the images were painted in a realistic manner, they made no sense. They didn't. Of course, the most famous surrealist painting is Salvador Dali's The Persistence of Memory, which shows, melting clocks and fishes in the middle of the sky and people not, just weird landscapes.
Based on dreams. They were big on dreams.
Yeah. So,
Again, the idea of not having any constraints around what you can achieve or what you can think about to be real.
Right.
And so what they did with this surrealism, first of all, Breton was a Marxist. He had joined the Communist Party. He must have been not a very nice guy, because even the communists kicked him out. I don't know what's going on with that. But he also wanted to tie in Freudian concepts, because there was a licentiousness to it as well. And a lot of the surrealist things you see kind of more vulgar nudity, men portrayed with noses that look like phalluses, stuff like that starts creeping in as well. And the whole point is to not only evoke feelings, of which, of course, you'll have sexual feelings in your unconscious, but to show that this is a higher plane of existence. To let these things out in the open, which we would have normally repressed, is the most intellectual way that you can approach. And if you don't understand it, it's not dirty. It's more thoughtful because it's probing those things that which we dare not speak, you know. Right. And so that's one of the ways that surrealism kind of smuggles in the sexual ethos by holding up this very high standard. And of course, most of the people, while they wouldn't, you know, in the 20s and 30s, they wouldn't necessarily buy a pornography book. Although it's interesting if you study early film had a lot of pornography in it. And it was the Film Standards Board that came in the late 1930s, early 1940s that put the kibosh on a lot of that. But most people wouldn't bring that into their homes. But with surrealist art, it was abstract enough to where they could put it on their walls. And their friends would come over, and of course the highbrow people would say, "We see how intelligent and affluent I am. You see how above the common man I am because I have this surrealist art and I can understand it." And it gives an air of legitimacy to crass ideas.
And I think with surrealism, the danger is that while you are concretizing your conscious, your dreams, in your dreams you don't have any consequences of hurting the others, right? In your dream, that's not possible.
Dreams are selfish by their nature.
Yeah. Whereas when it translates into concrete expression of that in culture, even if it's through the means of arts, we need to be understanding that we are all breathing the same air, and that does have consequences. Yeah. That's why we are talking about this today, that as to how this idea can actually lead society to a place of degradation.
And so those are the dangers that we need to look out for, because as you would say, Jacob, one of your favorite words, it's catechizing us, or baptizing us into a new social imaginary, as Charles Taylor would put it. And it happens slowly, and many times it is unconscious. So I want your comment on this one. So we have a ministry friend. His name is Vishal Mangawadi, and he had this brilliant Facebook post a few months ago, and I'm going to read it. I want your reaction. He said, "Billy Graham saved souls. Playboy Hefner discipled the nation. Both succeeded." So what do you think he means by that?
I think in terms of our approach to life, Christians have turned into schizophrenic existence, where our salvation merely concerns with spiritual matters in terms of saving the individual and nothing beyond that. And that's where the danger is. We should be understanding that we are not completely against the idea of being spiritually. I mean, that's where it begins. I mean, we have to have salvation, and it has to begin from reformation within, but it has to translate into everything. Christ for all and all for Christ, kind of, it permeates all spheres of our existence. What we've done is actually we limited our gospel only in the salvation of the individual and their soul, but we never translated that into our cultural products.
Right.
Whereas the secularist took over that realm and did well. And with Hugh Hefner, for example, he definitely was successful in discipling the nation, which we failed in.
So, like for instance, with Hugh Hefner, except with magazines, he kind of did what surrealists did with their paintings and their art. Truman covers this, but
everybody used to say, "Well, I only buy Playboy for the articles."
For the articles, right?
Yeah,
sure.
That was always the standing joke.
And the thing is, the reason why they were able to say that is because the articles were really top notch.
Some of them were. So he would mix the sublime and the profane is exactly what he would do.
Right. Because
it was part of the strategy.
Yes,
and Truman talks about that.
Right.
So that you can make it common even among those who may not want to buy it just for the reason that it is showing some naked pictures there.
Right.
So let's go back to the whole idea of the dream. Okay. Here's a common dream that we all have. Everybody's had it at one point. So you're walking into your school or your business meeting or whatever, and you find that you're naked. You have no clothes on, right? Everybody's had this. And there's a sense of embarrassment in that. Usually those dreams are fostered because there's some kind of feelings of inadequacy that maybe you're dealing with a project that you can't get a hold of, but most psychologists would say that's just, it's the emotion showing itself in a concrete way. But Breton and the surrealists say, well, how can't we use that then to solve life's problems? Well, there's a couple of questions that you would need to answer. The Christian would say, well, what is it that's making you embarrassed? And how can you conform your efforts better to society's understanding so that you can overcome those? Or you could take the Freudian way and say, what if we just made nudity passé and everybody can be nude and then you'll never feel embarrassed? You see, there's two ways to solve that problem. And what the surrealists are trying to do is they're trying to make the sexual aspect, normalizing it enough in order to make the person not feel bad about himself anymore. But in reality, if that actually happened to you in reality, there would be consequences for you. There would be consequences to those to whom you've exposed yourself, right? There will be other people's reactions, and they could actually be stigmatized in their own right.
Yeah.
But we don't think about that in the dream, and that's part of the problem of the process.
And within the church, it has had a consequence as well. We have completely abandoned a term. Let me ask you, when was the last time you heard anything on modesty?
Exactly, yes.
Right? When was the last time we had, if not sermon, at least a discussion? Even today, if you talk to parents, they're absolutely scared to talk about modesty to their children. What has happened? So by adopting this idea of surrealism and translating that into our cultural products, what we have done is actually abandoned the whole idea of what it means to be being with value that has to be preserved and maintained with reverence. Not just your own, but also the other.
Well, as Truman would say, the key thing to understand about surrealism is the individual authenticity. Again, it's back to the self. It's back to the self. So whatever makes you feel good, that is your guiding principle. So I know in typical philosophy, right, that's relativism. So this is couched in a little bit on the maybe the art form of that. I think that's great insight from Vishal. Like you were saying, Jacob, we just focus on the soul. We're almost like the reverse of surrealists, where we're just focusing on this one dimension, which is the soul, when really salvation extends to the whole thing, all of creation, right? We're part of that creation. So maybe that's going to be a topic for another show. How did we get there? How did we get to be little, I'm going to call it little Billy Grahams? We're just, the church, missions, everything is just about saving.
Fire insurance.
Right,
Yeah.
right, fire insurance.
That's
In
it.
fact, the Great Commission, right?
Yeah.
We keep forgetting. I know we say preach the gospel, but no. What's bigger than that is making disciples of nations. Preaching is part of that, but we need to make that top and
teaching
front
them
center.
all that Christ has taught us.
Yeah.
Here's a great example. 1 Corinthians 12 is a famous chapter that talks about being parts of the body, and you have the eye saying to the ear and things of that nature, right? But here, verse 23 is fascinating because Paul writes, "Those members of the body which we deem less honorable, on these we bestow more abundant honor, and our less presentable members become much more presentable." Now, what is he talking about there? He's talking about the areas of the body that we cover for modesty, right? He's talking about the genital areas that we deem less honorable, that we deem less presentable. But listen to what he says. He says, those less presentable members become much more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it. In other words, we cover those areas because they actually have more honor. They serve a more important purpose, and part of that purpose is modesty, is humility, and a recognition that we rise above merely the function of those things. Whereas the face or the hand, those can be exposed to the public all we want, and we don't have to worry about them. And I've never, ever heard a sermon on that. Ever.
Right.
And it's a fascinating scripture that I don't think most people have even thought through. So there's an example of how the church fails to catechize on issues of modesty and on issues of sex, where the Bible clearly teaches it.
I know we have a few seconds left, but at the second half hour, we're going to be talking about the effects of pornography, obviously the bad effects of I don't think there's any good effects of pornography. Yeah. So don't listen to that Lutheran pastor who thinks that there are good effects. But anyways, you have been listening to apologetics.com radio, and we have been discussing Chapter 8 of Carl Trueman's book. We will be right back after a few messages.
All right, let's get back to the apologetics.com radio show.
Welcome back to the second half hour of the apologetics.com radio show. We have been talking about Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. We're on Chapter 8. By the way, if you haven't picked up that book, I would encourage you to pick up a copy, read it. You will be blessed and you will be equipped. And we need to be, as I always say, we need to be like the men and women of Issachar, who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. Now it's like what the West ought to do. You know, we need men of Issachar, right? You'll find that in 1 Chronicles 12:32. Where are the men of Issachar today?
Well, there's not as many as there used to be, that's for sure. But
Right.
I think there's, who knows? Elijah thought he was all alone, and God said, I have 7,000 who have not bowed the knee. So
There you go.
There may be more out there that we just need to rally the troops and,
That's right.
and go out in faith.
I'll also add that I think I personally believe that church is good in doing analysis. Where we fail is actually to advocate what we believe
Yeah.
and actualize it in
That's a good point.
actual culture in which we live. Yeah. So there are a lot of people, I think, personally in my own life, I can point to and say that, they understand where the culture is. Mm-hmm. We are not lacking in discernment, but we are lacking in how do we actually convert that into practical things.
Yeah.
How does that speak into our family life, our community, our nation, and the world at large?
Right.
And that's where that's exactly what Vishal Mangalwadi was saying.
Yeah. Yep.
Soul is what we take care of, and we are good in analyzing things around us, but we don't know how to actually disciple the nations.
Right.
Talk into them positively.
Yeah.
The Great
to make
Commission.
a counter example. Yeah.
Well, we want to talk a little bit about how pornography leads to objectification of women. And for now, it sounds to me like the trajectory of Trueman's project really lands on this. So we're in a culture where, and I like this alliteration, right? Porn is the norm. In fact, in the book, right, Trueman was saying how there are even game shows that the winner of which would be part of a porn production, and they had contestants, and it's just crazy.
Well, it's like, I think there's even Love Island and Big Brother, and there's all these, even The Bachelor and Bachelorette. I don't know if the contestants on those shows actually have sex with each other. I've never watched them, but I do know that there's an editing feature that wants to imply that. It seems to imply that. And again, we've taken the idea of marriage and we've turned it into a competition that has about the same weight as a game of Monopoly.
Let's talk a little bit about that. What are the effects of porn? What are the effects of porn? Well, I mean, one is the person becomes a means to an end. They are not the end themselves in terms of a sexual union. And as Trueman would say, the sexual pleasure in the act of sex is detached from the bodily encounter now. So like you were saying, right, in a Freudian sort of context, it's just pleasure now, kind of like we're just children. We're kids. We're immature kids. We just want the thing now. What are the other harmful effects of porn that sometimes culture misses today?
Well, anytime you have immediate gratification be the ultimate goal of individuals, and especially in terms of relationships, what happens is the things of value decay. If you don't take care, and these are, again, things that parents tell their kids. No, you can't spoil your dinner, because if all you do is eat cake and candy, then you're too full to eat the stuff that actually gives you nourishment, and your body will decay. You'll turn fat, lazy, teeth will rot. That's what happens bodily. If you don't take care of your things, if you don't practice, your skills will decay. And if you want pleasure right now, what actually happens is not only do you lose the relationship potential with a spouse, but you also, the act of sex itself becomes mundane. And this is why we see over and over again, the stats are very, very clear that once you start imbibing in pornography, it immediately loses its allure, and it acts just like a drug where you have to find something new, something different, something unique, and usually it's more extreme, and it goes more and more and more extreme because every time it wears off and you need the next hit, that next hit has to be bigger and stronger. So just like a drug where you take more and more and more of it as your body adapts, so mentally you have to go for harder and usually more violent. And now you're assuming that what you see on the screen is how real relationships work, that you can, throw women around or choke them or whatever crazy.
fad is, yeah.
I know that there are things that I've not even thought about yet that I'm sure have like a fetish following. I have no idea. I don't even want to know them. Right. But that's what happens is you can never get that feeling again because you're shooting in the wrong trajectory. It's the relational aspect. It's the selfless act of sex, because that should be the desire. The ultimate act of selfishness is rape. I mean, in sex, that's what selfish sex is, right? Yeah. That's how you would define it.
Right.
So why is that the goal in all these other cases?
Right.
And in the scripture, we see that there is this aspect of relationality that you mentioned about as being a key thing when we understand the image of God on us.
Yeah.
Even when we read the scripture, we find that Adam knew Eve, right? That's how we explain.
That's a great word. Yeah.
That's how we explain the intimacy, which is more physical in that regard, right? So by getting into porn and disassociating ourselves from the individual, we basically are left with that vacuum that can never be fulfilled, right? We may have the pleasure for the moment, but we are left with that vacuum that brings in more guilt and more shame. And that's not what we are made for. If we are truly to be functioning in the way we are created, that intimacy has to happen at the level in the way it was designed to be, not outside of it.
Right, and because we cheapen that, then we inadvertently cheapen humanity in the process.
And within the church, if we see, I'm sure there are a lot of people listening to us who might be involved in church leadership and all. We can see that a lot of marriages have issues. Because, and one of the key reasons is that there is no integrity in terms of how husband and wife understand their sexual relationship. When they bring in porn or anything in between, that creates more tension and chaos.
Yeah, he doesn't fulfill my needs, right? And that isn't that the primary excuse for divorce?
Yeah,
is my needs are no longer being met. He doesn't. I don't feel the love that I wanted to feel. It's all self-driven.
Right. So. And again, that's what Truman says is the triumph of the self. The triumph of the therapeutic.
Yes.
It's all about us. So when something does not meet our, and just to use surrealism language, our dreams, then something's wrong. Because we ought to be able to fulfill our dreams, apparently, right? where dreams have no boundaries.
And if we see historically in any culture, it's not just Western phenomena, but also around the world, even in the East, wherever you have gone outside the sexual relationship, outside the bounds of marriage, whoever you've had sexual relationship with always be degraded or be put at a lower level, right? In earlier times, even in polygamy or even in that, you would always have one person in the relationship who would have higher status than the other, and the others would be treated in a different way.
Yeah.
And I think that gradation is not allowed for.
Yeah.
And that happens only when we go outside the bounds of the marriage.
Right. And so again, with the whole triumph of the therapeutic, we see some trends to support the idea that there are certain porn that might be helpful to a relationship, right? And how does that fail? I mean, there's no such thing, because I don't know how that'll make that a special category for anyone to consider.
I mean, it's like saying a little bit of robbery would be good.
Right.
To actually help someone,
Right.
right?
To help their situation.
Help
Sure,
their
yeah,
situation. I think it's the same logic there.
Right.
And isn't it interesting that one of the things that we're doing is we're denying the way we're actually built? For example, what is the natural end point of the sexual union? It's children.
Mm-hmm.
People have argued that abortion should be legal because, to bring an unwanted child into the world, and you're infringing upon a woman's right to maybe continue her education or not have this additional burden placed upon her. But what they're actually saying is, I want actions without consequences. I want to have the action of a sexual union, which we all know can produce children. That's its function. That's biologically what the sexual union is designed to do, is to create new human beings, create new image bearers. But we want to be able to do that without the consequences of that creation. So that's clearly self-centered. That's clearly sinful. And it's no wonder now that children have become an accessory to our lives instead of a function and a focus of our lives. We used to understand that the best blessings that we could have is to create the next generation of individuals who would carry our culture forward. And now what we see is, well, I want a kid to make me self-fulfilled.
Yeah. And now kids are seen as liabilities,
and that's why we see most people are only having one. I mean,
right.
we're not even reproducing ourselves enough to sustain our society.
Yeah, we know that's true in certain countries for sure.
Yeah, I think we need to redeem this thing that our sexuality has a telos.
Yes.
It has a goal and an end to it. At the same time, let me also touch on something. As Christians, we should remember that many times we emphasize on the fact of marriage, but we should be doing it for the right reason as well. Because I see a lot of people, they see marriage as a license to do sex, because they can't do that before, right? Which in one sense is.
In one sense it is.
It is. But if it is merely for that, there is a problem, right? So marriage has to be covenantal.
Right.
So your sexuality is not merely your identity in that regard, right? Sexuality is an important aspect of your life that you have to handle with care and has to be fulfilled within the union that God has established, but towards a telos, towards an end.
Right.
Right. And that
sexuality is the fruit of the pledging of one to the betterment of the other.
Yeah. Right.
And that's why sexuality is the fruit, because you've already established that I would give my life for you.
Yeah.
That we are bonded in sickness and in health, which means that there may be points where that sexual aspect falls by the wayside.
Yeah, and doesn't get fulfilled based on your expectations, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
We talked during the break about this kind of like worldview conflict between pornography and the feminist movement. Because if feminism were a legitimate movement, if they were to act on their feminist ideas, you would think that they would combat pornography. And yet, I think they're in a I'm calling a confusing conundrum. Do they support it or do they detest it? Maybe a feminist would support it in order to fulfill their inner being, right? So they remain true to their self or to the
Well, that's what they
man's
believe.
self. That's what they believe, right?
Yeah, that's what it's almost like that they're playing by a man's playbook. I mean, they've taught that modern feminism equals I can do anything a man can do. If a man can be promiscuous, I can be promiscuous too. Now, obviously, as those that bear children that become pregnant, it's a different function and different form. Also, testosterone does have a different motivating factor. We know this to be true biologically. Yeah. But yeah, it's why are people surprised when we take off all restrictions, when we create co-ed dorms, when we have sex week at Yale, when we say watch more pornography, and then we have the Me Too movement coming around and saying you're being
right.
What did you expect would happen?
Yeah, right.
If you open the car door and leave the keys in it, and the car door is running yes, people shouldn't drive away with a car, but do you really think that
should we be surprised, right?
Yeah. Is that a real surprise that some people are going to do so? What do you think is going to happen?
Right. And feminist movement has been, there is this aspect to it as well, that it has been a reaction to oppression of some kind as well. But at the same time, we need to understand that it has in no way some of the ways things have turned out to be. For example, the whole contraception thing, for example, or abortion. It has empowered the men even more to actually indulge in sexuality without any consequences. Right? So I think it has led to more oppression than what it was trying to actually combat.
So again, it's
earlier.
A worldview in conflict, right?
With itself.
It's not livable. The other one that I appreciate from Truman is his, observation that perhaps pornography could lead to lesbianism, and why again, gentlemen? Why would that lead to lesbianism?
Well, again, Truman, and he doesn't explicitly say this, but he implicitly says it. There's an old saying that men love women in order to get sex, and women give sex to men in order to get love. And what women are looking for ultimately is an emotional connection and an emotional relationship. And because the hookup culture is so commonplace, and you don't get that emotional relationship, how can you have an emotional relationship with a one-night stand? It's really impossible to do. You always feel dirty afterwards, the walk of shame, all of this. So women turn to each other because they are naturally wired to emote one to another. They draw on these emotional closenesses. And a lot of them say, well, if I can't find it with men, I'm just going to find it with my women friends. Now, that may initially, and especially in college when they're pushing, sexual expressionism, start off with lesbianism in a sexual engagement. But what they've all found is there's a term what we call lesbian bed death, is that when people say, how many of your friends, aren't having sex anymore who are lesbian couples? And usually the response is, well, how many are? Because there's nobody that I know of. It tends to be all about the emotion and not about the act.
And Lenny, you touched on this also. On the other side, with homosexuality, it leads to promiscuity, right?
Right. With men, it's the opposite. Men tend to be highly promiscuous, even within quote unquote committed homosexual relationships. Some stats have between 8 to 12 external hookups, external sexual engagements, even within committed homosexual relationships, so to speak. So because men are driven sexually, if they just let their feelings drive them, that's what they're going to look for.
Yeah. Here's another worldview in conflict. So if pornography is all about the sex act, right, immediate gratification, there's a movement now to have these sex robots. I think I've seen a documentary on it, and there's a whole factory of these kinds of machines, and I know some of them they're big in Japan.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I mean they're a tech giant, right?
And Japan's one of the lowest birth rates that were. I think it's 1.2.
That's right. That's right.
It cannot be reversed anymore. Yeah.
So another, again, worldview in conflict, because we know that it'll fail. And why will it fail? So here's the detachment. So pornography encourages or sustains this bodily detachment, and yet that's what they're longing for in a sex robot. Right? But they're never going to get that.
Right. Your robots can't be emotionally engaged. It was interesting. Truman quotes several people who've even ex-prostitutes and things like that who say, it's fascinating that if my clients come back to me, what they want is they want to find out who the real me is. They want to foster an emotional relationship, and they want backstory, and they want details, and they want to be part of your life by understanding
they want narrative,
who you
they
are.
want history. Yeah.
So, and of course, a robot has none of that. So, a robot would be, I would imagine, some kind of a significant investment, and you're pretty, you could write your own backstory, but how fulfilling is that? Because you already know the answers to all the questions you're going to ask it.
And going back to Genesis again, I'm going there again, just like Jesus,
sure.
you're pointing to the first.
No, good, because that's a good segue. We'll talk about what the church can do.
So if you see that when Adam was given the privilege of naming all the animals and everything, he does that. And what we find there, that he didn't find a helper suitable to him.
For him.
Right? Which
Absolutely.
will be true even in the case of robots or whatever that might be that we might come up with. But our longings will truly be only fulfilled in the partner that God has given us.
Yeah.
The one that we can really know in that intimate relationship.
Isn't that fascinating? Even robots are actually one step removed even from animals. At least animals have some sentience where they'll do the things that you don't want them to do, right? Robots don't even have that.
Yeah. Well, they're going to program that apparently into robots. At this point of our show, I do want to touch on what the church can do. How can we be counter-revolutionaries in this current sexual revolution? Because it is destroying families, and families, when they are destroyed, it's destroying communities. And when communities are destroyed, it's going to destroy our city and on outwards,
civilization.
Right? And civilization ultimately. Mm-hmm. When you hear the expression post-Christian, or we live in a post-Christian culture now,
right.
I think what brought that on is, again, the pornification of America, really. That's one of the main reasons. It's not so much that we got weak on theology or we got weak on ethics. It's more like we imbibed on these ideas and acted on these ideas, maybe, or maybe these ideas gave us permission to behave in neurotic ways, right?
Well, and again, pornography has lost its sense of shame. There are popular television sitcoms where they have entire episodes devoted to the main characters watching hours of pornography, and it's all done for a laugh.
Right.
But
it's normal.
But the Christian is derided. The Christian is where the shame shows. Oh, you believe that? You're the fundamentalist. You're the butt of the jokes of those same sitcoms. So that's where part of our post-Christian culture comes from. I think we need to show again how a sacralization of sex, just like a sacralization of individuals, rises us. It's more beautiful and is a more beneficial aspect. I think women would appreciate that message, especially those, again, who are in the Me Too movement, who would say, well, wouldn't it be nice if you didn't have to specifically spell out, don't tell sexually explicit jokes in the workplace? Why? Because civilized individuals don't do that. We used to have a culture that would say that, and we didn't need a Me Too movement.
Right.
Where did that go wrong? Or, how about an idea that you are as valuable because you're a child of your parents, and your children should be as valuable because they came from a loving relationship as well. Show the alternative to what's clearly not working.
Right.
I think Truman kind of touches on this, but on a different topic. But I think there's a need for us to reconnect sexuality with transcendence.
Yes.
That has to happen, and with goodness, truth, and beauty, how much it conforms with God's order of things, God's order of union between male and female. And that has to be taught. Children need to be taught. And I think...
And taught from the pulpit as well?
As well, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I
Preach
think
from the pulpit, sure.
the church leaders have to take the responsibility. We need to be speaking about this on Christian campuses and with young people. You know, they've been... Why is it that we are comfortable with them learning about sexuality in school, but not at home and in churches?
Yeah.
Why is it that? Why? Because we don't consider it to be a matter of sanctity.
Right.
We have to redeem the sanctity of sex back.
Right.
And we need to honor the Lord through it.
Right.
And in general, I think we need to teach that delayed gratification is an important aspect of what it means simply to be human.
Yeah.
And we don't talk about that anymore, because all of the richness of what we find is really if in our desires delayed for proper context.
Yeah.
And also we need to be also careful with our young people, the current generation, we were talking about this, that they are not feeling averse to sexuality either.
Yeah.
That they're running away from it and not wanting to make commitment in relationships that would last forever. You know, so we need to have a good balance in that we promote the goodness that is there in sexuality, promoting the telos. So what is good in coming together of individuals.
And then in terms of Christian education and even just education in general that happens in the church, that could happen from the pulpit, we need to mention and reverse this wrong idea that beauty is now attached to pornography or sexuality, because we see, I'm talking about Christians that see pornography as evil, which it is, but when they see a beautiful woman, they attach that right away to pornography. So we need to make sure that is kept separate.
And it's hard today because all of the fashion magazines, all of the television ads will take the most stunning women, and the way they portray their beauty is usually in a sexually salacious way. Not necessarily sexually explicit, but there's an inference there that beauty and sexuality are somehow tied together. And you never see, beauty as portrayed in, calico house coat or something to that effect. It's never with modesty.
Right. Well, I know our show is drawing to a close, so I am going to just end it unless you have 10 seconds. What I was going to say, I believe the men have to lead this as well.
Yeah,
the men have to lead this. If we're going to expect some change, it's the men that need to hear this, and they need to act on this, on some of the good advice we just mentioned. Well, thank you, gentlemen, for being part of the show. So you've been listening to apologetics.com radio, where we challenge believers to think and thinkers to believe. Our hope is that you've learned some aspect about the Christian worldview that strengthens your faith and make you want to learn more. So special thanks to Jacob and Lenny and our behind-the-scenes sound engineer. Special thanks to all of our listeners. Until next time, good night.